Good morning, and welcome to this special edition of Some Stops Along the Way. You probably can tell from my background that something's changed. And what has changed is that right now I am in Salzburg, Austria, getting ready to do some speaking engagements in Munich in a few days. And so I wanted to jump on and do this podcast remotely and expand on some of the discussions we've been having over podcasts 2 and 3. I call this section of the podcast Far From Home because it really talks about my first foray into the international development business. And that was the early projects that I did in Russia in the late 1990s. And some of the things we've been talking about over these last two podcasts, I think need to be unpacked a little bit more here, because you can never really understand the dynamics of Russian nationalism and the Russian view of the world. And I don't report to be an expert in this because I'm not Russian. I didn't grow up in Russia, obviously. And so my perception of this is based on historical paradigms, my own personal observations, and the discussions that I've had with many Russians during my work there. But to really understand some of the context behind how especially the Soviet mentality and what came after that has evolved, I think it's important to look at some historical paradigms. And of course, you can't do that without talking about the time of the czars and what came later. Of course, the last czar of Russia was Nicholas. And he was deposed in 1917 by the Bolsheviks, who we'll talk about in just a moment. And then his family, the Romanov family, was executed by the Bolsheviks in 1918. We talked a little bit about that in the last episode. But to understand the rise of the Bolsheviks, the Workers' Party, if you will, it's important to understand the context of the time. And the Bolsheviks' emergence in Russia was part of an overall expansion of ideas and an approach espoused by Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and others. And I want to talk about Marx for just a little bit. Karl Marx was one of the thought leaders of his time. He was a philosopher and someone who had the worldview that the amassing of capital was essentially based on the utilization of free or very inexpensive labor from the working man. Basically, his point of view was that wealth was amassed by the exploitation of the working class. And this came at a time when in Europe it was the height of the period of monarchy in many countries, Russia being one of those. The czars were extremely powerful. They were extremely wealthy. Those that surrounded the czars and the other monarchs in Europe tended to be the elite of society, while the workers toiled in poor conditions in factories, in the fields, etc. And so it was almost inevitable that a movement like this would begin to build. And that was the seeds of the Bolsheviks. From the standpoint of Marx, his writings, his early writing, which was called a contribution to the critique of political economy, was a precursor to something even bigger, which was a 3-volume exposition called Das Kapital. I actually have Das Kapital in Russian, a copy that was given to me. Obviously, I don't read Russian, but it is interesting to have it in Russian since it was translated into the Russian language in 1872. So Das Kapital proposes something called the laws of motion, which the mode of production from its origins to the future is described by the dynamics of the accumulation of capital. Essentially, Marx proposes that the driving force of capital is the exploitation of labor, as I said before. Das Kapital is a seminal work in the movement that became known as communism. So now let's talk about the Bolsheviks, and specifically Vladimir Lenin. Lenin's philosophy, Lenin became very enchanted with Marx, and Lenin's whole philosophy, at least initially, was outlined in a political pamphlet called What is to be Done. It was written in 1901, and what it did was it helped precipitate a split between the Bolsheviks and another group that I won't talk a lot about called the Mensheviks. But it was the foundation stone of the Socialist Party, which eventually became the Communist Party. So the Bolsheviks were essentially a labor-minded party, if you will. Their focus was on protection of the exploitation of the working class and the redistribution of wealth. This was at the core of Marx's philosophy, redistributing wealth to create fairness in society. Lenin argued that not only was Marx right, but also that capitalism created inequities in society and therefore was a movement in the wrong direction in terms of political economies. The Bolsheviks grew in power and, as we said before, eventually overthrew the czars in 1917, and then from that time created what came to be known as the Communist Party. Very interesting indeed as far as the background for everything that we've been discussing. So let's put this in context. Once Lenin took over in 1917, it created a movement that really transformed Europe and the world. A succession of rulers came after him, one of the most notable of which was Stalin, who was Georgian. I've been to Stalin's hometown of Gori, Georgia. Strangely enough, Stalin started off as studying the ministry. He wanted to be a priest. And he became one of the most polarizing rulers of Russia, of the Soviet Union, actually, to be clear in the vernacular. And he purged many of those that that stood by him and were his friends during the period of Lenin. And then, of course, there have been iconic Soviet leaders after Stalin as well. One of the more notable was Nikita Khrushchev, who made the statement that "we will bury you," and was a seminal figure along with John F. Kennedy in the Cuban Missile Crisis. There were a series of rulers after him, leading up to Mikhail Gorbachev, who, along with Reagan and Thatcher, is given credit for the tearing down, if you will, of the Iron Curtain and the change in the system of government and the dissolution of what was known as the Soviet Union. Let me be clear, though, that Mikhail Gorbachev may or may not have been an enlightened Soviet ruler, but certainly it was not his intent initially to dismantle the Soviet Union. There were a lot of inaccuracies, I thought, in the movie Reagan that came out not long ago, but one of the accuracies was that Star Wars played a seminal role in quote-unquote convincing Gorbachev that the system of government had to change. Star Wars, for all intents and purposes, was a figment of Reagan's imagination. It was a bluff. But it was a bluff that he played out very shrewdly. And that threat of Star Wars was one of the things that lingered in Gorbachev's mind and drove him to the point where he made the decision to move forward with a transformation of the government. Of course, it wasn't totally his decision. The Soviet bloc had already started to crumble by that time, and when Hungary opened the borders its borders in 1989, so that citizens could have a route of departure out of the communist bloc, that was the seeds that eventually led to the dissolution of the communist bloc, the tearing down of the Berlin Wall, which was a manifestation of that, etc. So there's just a lot to unpack, but I thought it was important for us to really understand what the context of this whole discussion of Russia is all about. I hope you enjoyed that. It's not a long podcast today, but it's one I thought was important, and this is a supplemental episode. So it'll hopefully tie a little bit of a bow around what we've been discussing about Russia and give you a little more context that you can use to put everything into perspective. I'm Mark McCord, coming at you from Salzburg, Austria, in this special edition, if you will, of some stops along the way. Thanks for joining, and see you next Monday.